Hey everybody, this is a piece by a Giorgio Galli. It's an introduction to economic and social structure of Russia today, which is by Amadeo Bordiga. This is originally from 1966. Here we are. 45 years ago, in January 1921, the Communist Party of Italy, a section of the Third International, was founded in Livorno. The PCI still harks back to this origin. The promoters of the party's constitution have previously fought their battle in the left-wing fraction. Had previously fought their battle in the left-wing fraction of the PSI. Some of those men have now become political legends. Gramsci, Tagliati. Others have linked their fame to their academic activity, such as Angelo Tosca, author, among other things, of the birth and advent of fascism, or to their work as writers such as Ignazio Silone. I'm going to look up some of these people. Obviously, we all know who Gramsci is, but I don't know who Angelo Tosca is. Wikipedia says Angelo Tosca lived from 1892 to 1960 and was an Italian politician, writer, and historian. Born in Moretta in the Piedmont region of Italy, Angelo Tosca was a founding member of the Communist Party of Italy, but was expelled in 1929 for his opposition to Stalinism and supporting the right opposition of Nikolai Bukharin. Having experienced persecution by the fascist regime in Italy, Angelo Tosca took refuge in France in 1926 and gained citizenship in 1936. After joining the French section of the Workers' International in 1934, Angelo Tosca worked as a writer for the newspaper Le Populaire. Tosca joined the exiled Italian Socialist Party and supported the POUM during the Spanish Civil War. After the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939 and the consequent resignation of Pietro Nenni, Angelo Tosca became one of three joint leaders of the PSI, which was the Socialist Party of Italy. After the fall of France, Angelo Tosca aligned himself with the pro-German Vichy government. He held an official position under Paul Marion in the Ministry of Information. Angelo Tosca was arrested in September 1944 after the liberation of France and was charged with collaborationism, but was released only a month later after it emerged that he had secretly worked with a Belgian anti-fascist network since 1941. After the war, Angelo Tosca worked for various newspapers, was a consultant for NATO, and maintained an anti-communist/anti-Stalinist position during the Cold War. In 1960, Angelo Tosca died in Paris. His daughter, Catherine Tosca, was France's Minister of Culture from 2000 to 2002 and a senator from 2004 to 2017 for the French Socialist Party. It appears like Angelo Tosca's book. Let's see. The book they mentioned, The Rise of Italian Fascism. I don't know if I'm seeing any good descriptions of this book. Ignazio Silone, I've seen this name before. Ignazio Silone was the pseudonym of a Secondino Tranquilli. He lived from 1900 to 1978. Ignazio Silone, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, was an Italian politician, novelist, essayist, playwright, and short story writer, world famous during World War II for his powerful anti-fascist novels. Considered among the most well-known and read Italian intellectuals in Europe and in the world, his most famous novel, Fantomara, became emblematic for its denunciation of the condition of poverty, injustice, and social oppression of the lower classes, has been translated into numerous languages. From 1946 to 63, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. For many years in anti-fascist exile abroad, Silone participated actively and in various phases of Italian politics, animating the cultural life of the country in the post-war period. Ignazio Silone was among the founders of Italy's Communist Party in 1921. He was later expelled for his dissidence with the Stalinist party line and moved to democratic socialist positions. The break with the Italian Communist Party in the years after World War II led him to be often opposed by Italian critics and rehabilitated belatedly, despite a controversy about his relations with the Italian fascist secret police, while for all his career he was particularly appreciated abroad. All right, back to the text. Almost completely ignored, however, is the man who gave the greatest personal contribution, in terms of action and ideas, to the creation of the Communist Party, of which he became the first political secretary, Amedeo Bordiga. Togliatti wrote about him before dying, recalling the formation of the communist leadership group of the early years. Quote, the immediate direction of all the work of the party was entrusted by the Central Committee to an executive committee, including Bordiga, Grieco, Tarasini, Riposi, and Forticiari. The true leader of all the work, however, was Amedeo Bordiga. Amedeo Bordiga was endowed with a strong political personality and notable leadership skills. For years, Amedeo Bordiga had carried out systematic work in organizing his own faction within the Socialist Party, and had thus acquired vast knowledge and prestige among the leaders of the left of the movement. Amedeo Bordiga knew how to command and be obeyed. Amedeo Bordiga was energetic in his polemics with his adversaries, although mostly scholastic in his argumentation. All this had the consequence that the group was centralized almost exclusively around Bordiga. The belief was created that Bordiga was the true, quote, leader of the party needed, and that Bordiga would always lead it well, even in the most difficult situations, end quote. That's from Togliatti. This, then, was the Bordiga of the Livorno years, described by Togliatti, who was first a fervent disciple and admirer, and then a harsh and devaluing adversary, a personality, therefore, of considerable importance. As a political leader, his destiny was sealed by the fact that the party born in Livorno was revolutionary, while he would have had to quickly adapt to a political line dictated by the affirmation of capitalist stabilization in Europe and Stalinist involution in the USSR. This historical course inexorably placed Bordiga on the margins and then outside the party he had led, just as it placed first on the margins and then outside Lenin's International the men who had been its founders, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Radek, etc. But the reason for the silence surrounding Bordiga's name are not to be found only in this political affair, but also in a personal attitude. A book has recently been published entitled History of the Communist Left, which, as the presentation states, quote, recalls on the basis of rigorous historical documentation the process through which the communist left present in Italy albeit in an embryonic form since about 1880, but well defined by the solidity of its theoretical approach and continuity of practical action starting from 1910, emerged from the bosom of the Socialist Party in the incessant battle waged before and during the war against reformism, a battle that will be the necessary prelude to the constitution of the Communist Party of Italy. End quote. In this history of the communist left, the personal contribution of Amadeo Bordiga is clearly preeminent, but the book's presentation itself ends with these words, quote, both today's text and the text of that time are anonymous, both because we consider them not as an expression of personal ideas and, quote, opinions, but as party texts, and the first for the additional reason that it is the fruit of a collective work of research. Reorganization and compilation, to which no personal label is appropriate, and which not only does not involve, but excludes the bourgeois and mercantile vindication of the worst form of intellectual property, the, quote, intellectual one, end quote. This position of Bordiga, but with regard to, quote, intellectual property, explains why Bordiga's name is still little known today, given that Bordiga has always believed it right to present his writings as completely independent of his person, and at this point it remains to be clarified why his name was instead placed at the head of this book now published, which is the most organic of Bordiga's writings on the historical experience of the October Revolution, and which is therefore the first, quote, book by Amadeo Bordiga to be published. The reason can be found in what Bordiga himself recalls in the third chapter of this volume, recalling the position of the various groups of the Second International in the crucial summer of 1914. Quote, people and their names only help with didactic mnemonics. Perhaps it is also a little our fault if we get indigestion from them, end quote. Enemy of, quote, intellectual property, Bordiga understands, however, the need for, quote, didactic mnemonics, end quote. And precisely for this reason, the book appears with Bordiga's name, which reminds and must remind the reader that the text is due to a man who founded and directed the Communist Party of Italy, who lived alongside Lenin and Trotsky during the period of the great revolutionary historical opportunity of the 1920s. Bordiga is practically the only survivor of the men of the Third International who, almost half a century after Red October, attempts a broad-ranging assessment with the same ideas and same methods of analysis as then. Marxism restored by Lenin. The reader will find numerous times in the text the conception of Marxism as a global and invariable body of doctrine whose, quote, throughout history and, quote, continuity of interpretation and application must be guaranteed only through another continuity, that of the Revolutionary Party, which expresses and synthesizes the experience of the proletarian class. For the sake of clarity, however, it is appropriate to report this same concept here in the synthetic form in which Bordiga expressed it, in a pamphlet also anonymous published with the title Sul filo del tempo. Quote, the term, quote, Marxism is not used in the sense of a doctrine discovered or introduced by Karl Marx personally, but to refer to the doctrine that arises from the modern industrial proletariat and, quote, accompany the modern industrial proletariat through the course of a social revolution. And we retain the term, quote, Marxism, despite the vast field of speculation and exploitation of Marxism by a series of anti-revolutionary movements, The history of the Marxist left, of radical Marxism, and more precisely, Marxism, in italics, consists in the successive resistances to all the, quote, waves of revisionism that have attacked various aspects of the doctrine and method, starting from the organic monolithic formation that can be made to coincide with the manifesto of 1848, Marxism itself cannot be a doctrine that is shaped and reshaped every day with new contributions and with the substitution of, quote, pieces, or rather patches, and, quote, patches, exclamation point, because it is still, even though it is the latest, one of the doctrines that are the weapon of a dominated and exploited class that must overturn social relations, and in doing so is subject in 1,000 ways to the conservative influence of the traditional forces and ideologies of the class enemies. Although the ideological endowment of the revolutionary working class is no longer revelation, myth, idealism, as for the previous classes, but positive, quote, science, it nevertheless needs a stable formulation of its principles and also of its rules of action, which fulfills the tasks and has the decisive efficacy that dogmas, catechisms, tables, constitutions, guidebooks such as the Vedas, the Talmud, the Bible, the Quran, or the Declaration of Rights have had in the past. A new doctrine cannot appear at any moment, but there are certain and very characteristic and also very rare epochs in history in which it can appear like a beam of dazzling light, and if one has not been once the crucial moment has been identified and the terrible light has been fixed, it is useless to resort to candles. For the modern proletarian class formed in the first countries of great capitalist industrial development, the darkness was torn apart shortly before the middle of the century preceding the present one. The integral doctrine in which we believe, in which we must and want to believe, then had all the data to form itself and describe a course of centuries that will have to verify and reaffirm it after immeasurable struggles. Either this position will remain valid or the doctrine will be convinced of being false, and the declaration of the appearance of a new class with its own revolutionary character, program, and function in history will have been given in vain. End quote. Amadeo Bordiga. It is in light of this approach to the concept of Marxism that Bordiga analyzes Marxism's Leninist movement, which grew in Europe in coincidence with the First World War and the collapse of the Second International, reaching its culminating point with the foundation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the first state conceived as being under proletarian leadership, after the more limited precedent of the Paris Commune, which followed the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. On the events that led from February to October 1917, then, and gradually through the Civil War, the new economic policy and the struggles within the Bolshevik Party, up to the affirmation of the Stalinist regime, there are now, even in Italy, several valuable publications, from the new edition of the classic History of the Russian Revolution by Trotsky, to The Opposition in the Soviet State by Leonard Shapiro, to the first 2 volumes by Edward Carr, The Bolshevik Revolution and the Death of Lenin, The Initial Nucleus of the Vast, A History of Soviet Russia, 1917 to 1940, by the English historian, to the well-known volume by Deutscher on Stalin, and the trilogy on Trotsky, The Prophet Armed, The Prophet Unarmed, The Prophet Outcast. There are also various historical publications on the Bolshevik Party, among which the most satisfactory is probably that of Rudolf Schlesinger. One second. Is Rudolf Schlesinger somebody? I don't know. Anyway, back to the text. All these editorial initiatives date back to the last decade and correspond to the greater openness and greater interest in a critical vision of Soviet events that coincides with the period of crisis that began after Stalin's death. Today, in essence, the Italian reader has at his disposal a series of texts that allow him to form a sufficiently clear idea of the decisive events of the historical period that goes under the name of the Russian Revolution, far from both hagiographies and denigrations. In this framework, Bordiga's writings occupy, however, a very particular and irreplaceable place. They place the Russian Revolution in the historical course of the revolutionary process of the proletariat, as seen by Marxism, analyzing it as it can be done, half a century later, by a man who has lived and lives this process, and the multiplicity of experiences to which it gives rise, interpreting it with the same methodology that was Lenin's. Today, not only, quote, the term, quote, Marxism, but also the figure and work of Lenin is, as Bordiga would say, quote, a vast field of speculation and exploitation, end quote, and delving into multiple interpretations of the personality and action of the Bolshevik leader is the task that even historians have only partially tackled. But as far as Lenin is concerned, the political leader of the years in which he linked his name to the choices that made Russian history take a certain course in the first quarter of the century, I believe it can be said that his method of reasoning and acting was an expression of the use, in the same way, of the identical method with which Bordiga reconstructed the events. Plekhanov, Lenin's teacher, and considered the father of a whole generation of Russian Marxists, wrote in 1898 a very famous essay titled The Function of Personality in History, seen in the light of the Marxist conception. This text has remained the basis of what Marxists think about the dialectical connection between the role of the individual and the course of events predetermined by general causes. Quote, in social relations, Plekhanov concluded his essay, quote, there is a certain logic. As long as men are in given mutual relations, men will inevitably feel, think, and act just like this and not otherwise. It would be useless for politicians to struggle against this logic, the natural course of things, parenthesis, that is, this very logic of social relations, and parenthesis, would reduce all their efforts to nothing. But if I know in what sense social relations change as a result of certain changes in the social and economic process of production, I also know in what sense social psychology will also change. Consequently, I have the possibility of influencing it. Influencing social psychology means influencing historical events. Therefore, in a certain sense, I can make history now, and I do not need to wait until it is made, end quote. Plekhanov. If this is the function of personality in history according to the Marxist conception, it is because, to quote Plekhanov again, quote, the personal peculiarities of the leaders determine the individual physiognomy of historical events, and the elements of chance always exercise some influence in the course of these events, the direction of which is determined, in the final analysis, by the so-called general causes, that is, by the development of the productive forces and of the relations that this development determines between the people engaged in the economic and social process of production, end quote. Plekhanov. It can be said, in the light of these considerations, then, that the peculiar character of this publication appears in all its evidence. The function of Bordiga's personality at the time of the foundation of the Communist Party of Italy was illustrated by Togliatti. The function of Bordiga's personality today is, presumably, that of being the only living revolutionary of the generation that knew Lenin and worked with Lenin, who, without modifications from what he was then, a living symbol of that, quote, invariance of Marxism that he describes, has been able to write in these years a work of vast scope that synthesizes the experience of several generations of revolutionary militants. Quote, "Our work," one can read in the 9th chapter of this book, "is nothing but an attempt to write not a history, in the sense that in the sense that right-thinking people indicate with the term, quote, historiography, end parenthesis, but some chapters of historical science, a term that for all modern thought is a blasphemy. Modernism boasts of having banished causality and determinism from all sciences, even natural and non-human. Parenthesis, for Marxism, the science of the human species is a natural science, end parenthesis, only because many problems, for a time not at all recent, are faced and solved as far as mathematical apparatus is concerned, with the probabilistic method. That is, it is not assumed that the precise value of the knowledge data has been determined by means of discovered laws, but only that knowledge of a certain field of values has been established, in which the data being asked for will most likely, quote, wander. A knowledge of the future, parenthesis, better to say of the unknown, since an unknown from the past could be 100 times more difficult to calculate than one from the future. Let's say the chemical composition of the black that Cleopatra was putting before her eyes, and the time to the minute of the next lunar eclipse, end parenthesis, that is rigorous and punctual, obligatory and certain, would be replaced by an elastic and approximate one. We do not develop here the point that this alternative is reduced to philosophical masturbation from spineless times. The absolute certainty of the solution is nothing but a convenient fiction, a convention that, in the practice of the species, is always played well, giving birth to a flaming power of knowledge, like the classic looking for the east for the west, like Galileo's, quote, altissimum planatum tergeminum observavo, who was the first to spot the ringed Saturn. Mathematical certainty is nothing but an expedient to avoid making too full a blunder. The collective endowment of experience of the species, which in history we call religion, philosophy, empiricism, science, is a building erected by many stones, on each of which one can write individual nonsense, ... This digression serves to emphasize that naturally we too are influenced by the traditional way of treating the subject, and just as we are victims of the abuse of the names of illustrious people, so we are of the mania for, quote, mathematical dates. In dealing with Russia, we developed a first part which tested the Marxist exposition of the history of that country up to the Great Revolution. We then passed to the theme of the current Russian structure, and the content of this exposition is divided into two parts: the struggle for power in the two revolutions, and the part more specifically directed to the theme, that is, to prove the thesis that Russian society today is capitalist in young development, not socialist, end quote. Bordiga. The passage sums up the essence of the book, both in terms of method, parenthesis, Bordiga also has a mathematical background. His profession is that of an engineer, end parenthesis, and in terms of the object of the discussion, quote, some chapters of historical science, parenthesis, aimed, end parenthesis, at proving the thesis that today's Russian society is a young capitalist society, end quote. The complete picture of the work will be available only after the publication of the second volume, this first one stopping at the period preceding the launch of the 5-year plans, but the point at which it aims to synthesize the Marxist experience after the first half of the century is already well defined. The controversies that developed within the revolutionary workers' movement after the involution of the Third International on the social nature of the USSR are well known. From when Trotsky coined the definition of, quote, degenerate workers' state, to when, among his followers and students, the theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism began to be formulated, seen as an economic system of production different from both capitalism and socialism. Bordiga only briefly refutes these assessments, remaining firm as he is in the conception of Marxism as a, quote, integral doctrine that had from the beginning, parenthesis 1848, and parenthesis, quote, all the data to form itself and describe a course of centuries that will have to verify and reaffirm it, end quote. It is therefore within the framework of this conception, of this method, that the, quote, chapters of historical science, end quote, included in this book can be usefully read. It is the course of the centuries alone that will be able to establish whether these chapters are stones of the, quote, collective endowment of experience of the species, end quote, or that they will be completely useless because, quote, the doctrine will have been convinced of something false, end quote. Once this way of reading is adopted, Bordiga's exposition can assume its full value, which is that of learning the history of the Russian Revolution as a moment of the proletarian revolution, as it can be written by someone who places himself within this experience, and places himself within it today, but with the same spirit and with the same method as someone who lived in its epic moments, thus realizing the synthesis of history as action, and as reflection, which is a synthesis very rarely produced, and which, as far as the Russian Revolution is concerned, was produced only in the works of Trotsky up to 1940. Bordiga makes frequent references to these works and to their author, and in many respects and beyond, the controversies that are currently dividing political groups that refer to the tradition of revolutionary Marxism. This work by the founder of the Italian Communist Party can be seen as the continuation and development of the, quote, chapters of historical science, end quote, written by the leader of the Red Army. Anyone who has read Deutscher's latest volume, The Exiled Prophet, which I guess, like I said, I don't know if I said this, but this is a translation. I'm using Google Translate to read this from Italian. Has been, The Prophet Outcast is what it's called, has been able to sense, beyond the author's particular interpretations, the sense of emptiness of the man who, after having led gigantic masses of fighters into battle, finds himself the object of the persecution of a monstrous apparatus, born in the very heart of what had been the party of the revolution, and to which Trotsky can only oppose his pen as a writer, embittered by the continuous conflicts of the small groups of followers in whom he nevertheless saw the new revolutionary movement in formation. Bordiga, who lived the same experience as Trotsky, but in a smaller room as regards operational responsibilities, seems to be endowed with a more serene character, with a wisdom that is decidedly Neapolitan environmental traits, as do many expressions that he adopts in the course of the discussion. As much as Trotsky felt himself to be a, quote, writer, Bordiga, as we have seen, despises the, quote, quote, intellectual property. Trotsky always saw the wrath of the proletarian uprising of a new October as close, and Bordiga always saw it as very postponed in time. In 1926 and 1945, when the situation could appear to others more objectively revolutionary in the Marxist sense than it actually was. Trotsky thought the time had come to found a new international, the Fourth, on the eve of the Second World War, while Bordiga did not see the conditions for it 20 years after its conclusion. Today, Bordiga foresees, parenthesis, Bordiga also mentions it in the 9th chapter already cited, in parenthesis, 1975 is the possible date for a new revolutionary wave coinciding with a possible Third World conflict. These are the differences between the two personalities, which, however, are greatly attenuated, almost to the point of disappearing, when they translate into a personal effort of exposition the data of the collective experience accumulated by the revolutionary movement of Marxist inspiration. Their, quote, chapters of historical science, end quote, have much in common precisely because they are a synthesis of history as action and reflection that that both have experienced in the context of Marxist thought. For this reason, Bordiga's work can be considered parallel to Trotsky's work. Both are committed to systematizing the Leninist and Stalinist experience, carried forward in a period of revolutionary outflow in the advanced industrial countries, and of reorganization of Russian society on bases increasingly different from those that had been envisaged in October. Compared to Trotsky, Bordiga has the advantage of having written when much more experience had been accumulated. The revolution betrayed had been elaborated by Trotsky on the basis of data and documents from 30 years ago, while the present work was written taking into account the situation as it presented itself in the mid-1950s. The further evolution in the years of the Khrushchevite reforms and up to those proposed by the last Central Committee of the CPSU, September 1965, seems to go practically in the direction indicated by the Bordigian interpretation, in the sense that the common and similar elements between the traditional capitalist economy and the Soviet economy have become increasingly evident. The economy of the most industrially advanced Western countries has today come to assume the characteristics of an increasingly coordinated and rationalized capitalism, in which the role of public authorities has increased, without the fundamental characteristics of a market economy having disappeared. On the other hand, rigid and centralizing planning based on collective ownership of the means of production, a peculiarity of the Soviet economy in the years in which Trotsky was writing, is today giving way in the USSR to forms in which the orientation set by the Gosplan in terms of investments and income distribution tends to coexist with the growing autonomy of the company production bodies around which a real market is increasingly being structured. Thus, the fundamentally capitalist categories, in the sense that Marx gave to this term, of price, profit, accumulation, reproduction, and circulation of capital, tend to reappear, even terminologically, in the Soviet Union, almost half a century after the October Revolution. And the current effort of the Soviet leadership to reconcile this socioeconomic and productive reality with the residues of Leninist terminology comes up against ever greater obstacles both within the USSR and within the system of countries that call themselves socialist. In parallel, in fact, to the process of evolution of Soviet society towards forms that are increasingly similar to those of classical capitalism, which in turn has been evolving, a new critical process opens up within the same communist movement that was once under Soviet leadership. At the origin of this process is the reference to Leninism. This is not the place to ascertain how well-founded it is, to which the Chinese Communist Party appeals, which begins to extend its criticism precisely to the relations of production and class that are increasingly clearly asserting themselves in the USSR. However suggestive the theories that refer to the emergence of a new form of production, collectivism, bureaucracy, that is different from capitalism without being socialist, thus breaking the logical succession of production cycles as Marxism has defined them, and to which the volume constantly refers, it seems that the events that have occurred over the last 20 years provide more arguments to those who do not see, instead in the USSR, an exception to the rule of capitalist development. These problems may appear in a clearer light when this first volume is completed, as mentioned by the second soon to be published, particularly dedicated to the modalities of the industrialization process in the USSR as they have been established with the launch of the 5-year plans during the quarter of a century that ended in the mid-1950s. But it can already be said that, with this book, readers have at their disposal a first text with a broad historical perspective, elaborated by a, quote, personality in the Marxist and Plekhaноvian sense, practically irreplaceable today in this, quote, function, which is placed along a line of clear continuity in the tradition of thought commonly called the, quote, classics of Marxism, end quote. The end. Thanks for listening.